Welcome everyone to the final session of our series, Anger and Kabbalah, Confronting Divine and Human Rage through the Zohar. So tonight, we'll bring together a number of the ideas that we've studied thus far, the relationship between divine and human anger, the relationship between anger and the demonic possession, and the perpetual struggle, both divine and human, with conflicting internal forces. We'll conclude with an astonishing passage in the Zohar, portraying Moses physically restraining God, following that with a teaching by an early Hasidic sage, Yaakov Yosef of Polonia, about the struggle with alien thoughts, including anger. So I'd love to be able to just jump right on in. I know it's a little bit of a heavier topic, but without further delay, Dr. Berman, Rabbi Silber.
Okay, good evening, everybody. This is our fourth and final session, it's a quick visit we've had with each other 4 times, we'll close out with a bang here. And I think the focus of today's session, aside from looking at some materials, which in a way recapitulate themes we've done earlier in this class, to focus on a set of practices or rituals that portray grappling with both divine and human anger. And so without further ado, I'm going to plunge in. Again, we're going to drive towards these last 2 readings. One, a grappling that portrays as Moses grappling with God physically, I guess modeled on the Jacob grappling with the angel, and then people grappling with themselves, and that is that Hasidic teaching that Yehudis referred to in her intro. So I'm going to go to my PowerPoint, and here we go. As you can see, I chose the image, a mid-19th century painting of Jacob wrestling with the angel, and by the end of tonight's class, you'll see why I chose that image. And how the Zohar transposes it to Moses grappling with God. But before we get to that, we're going to do, I guess, what is sort of a review in some ways, not the same readings, but readings that have some of the same import or similar import, related import to those we've done earlier. And we're going to start off with a reading from the Talmud, from Mashav Nedarim, in which it says like this. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani said in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, one who becomes angry, all kinds of hell rule over him. That's what it says. Kol minei gehinom sholtim bo. For it is written, remove anger from thy heart and put away evil from thy flesh. Now, evil can only mean hell. Okay, and the way this passage is reading the verse from Kohelet is that it's causative. Remove anger from thy heart, and you will in this way put away evil from thy flesh. And evil can only mean hell, ein ra'a ela gehinom. And this is the idea that if the people become angry, evil, hell dwells within them. It dwells in their flesh. All kinds of hell rule over him. There are lots of different commentators on this passage, and of those many commentators, I chose a great Kabbalist from what is today Iraq, a Baghdadi Kabbalist named Chacham Yosef Chaim, who's most known for his book, The Ben Ish Chai, which is a Kabbalistic work of halacha. But this is his commentary to the Talmud called the Sefer Benayahu Ben Yehoyada. And he's commenting on this passage that I just read. One who becomes angry, all kinds of hell rule over him. That's a quote from the Talmud. And then Yosef Chaim says, what are kinds of hell? What does this mean? And it's a beautiful passage. I set it up as verse because I think it really works as verse. What are kinds of hell? There is the hell of fire, and there is the hell of hail, and there is the hell of smoke. These 3 visions or appearances appear in one who becomes angry. There is one who becomes angry whose face is red, and there is one whose face becomes white. Thus there's the color of fire, which is red, and the color of hail, which is white. And there is one who becomes angry and blows breath. He sort of huffs and puffs, blows breath and a strong wind. And this corresponds to the hell of smoke. So this Talmudic passage, especially in the interpretation of Chacham Yosef Chaim, very much resonates with the other Talmudic passage we did about that talked about the alien God dwelling within a person who becomes angry. And here we have these three kinds of hell, according to Yosef Chaim, that dwell within a person. It describes the person's face. And we can recognize that. Someone who gets red in the face, someone who gets white in the face, someone who huffs and puffs when they get angry. And hell inhabits them. And that's the meaning of that quote from the pasuk from Kohelet, of removing anger, and therefore, or by that means, you will remove evil from your flesh. And again, it's the sense of possession, here possession by hell, by Gehinnom. And I just wanted to go back to that idea, this theme of possession that we've looked at a number of times. And I guess I didn't say at the beginning of my remarks, when the PowerPoint is on the screen, just feel free to interrupt. You don't have to raise your hand. I can't see you anyway when the PowerPoint is on the screen, so just interrupt and start speaking. And hopefully it will only be one at a time, but feel free, please. Any comments so far? Beth.
Yeah, I was looking in JPS because it's not like I know Kohelet all that well, but I was kind of struck by your translation. And JPS translates that pasuk from 11:10, and banish care from your mind and pluck sorrow out of your flesh, for youth and black hair are fleeting.
Yeah.
Pluck sorrow.
That's more of a paraphrase. I mean, let's look at the Hebrew. The translation I used is the King James, which is my favorite, even if it's not always the most accurate. The pasuk says, "Haser kaas milibecha," right? So the word there is kaas, "V'haver ra'a mibsarecha," and remove evil from your flesh. And whatever motivated the JPS translation, whatever motivated the JPS translation, the King James translation is actually faithful to how the Talmud understands it, because the Talmud quotes the passage in the context of anger, and then it identifies the evil there with hell. It says,
the King James is accurate. The King James is generally speaking quite accurate.
Yeah.
And the JPS, my publisher, and one of my publishers, is generally speaking much less accurate. They sacrifice truth for beauty,
there you go.
generally speaking. So they're really not that accurate. In this case, they're very inaccurate. And what you said, of course, is very accurate.
Yeah. I sometimes when I teach, I refer to the King James version as the translation of Hamelach Yaakov, because James is, of course, is English for Yaakov, Jacob. So we could just refer to it as, Tirgum Hamelach Yaakov, or maybe we could use Aramaic. Tirgum the Yaakov Malka. Okay, let's go.
Dr. Berman,
Sure.
could I just ask about the references to the colors red, white, particularly? I mean, can you map those to the other ways that those colors are represented in the Sefirot, Chesed and Gevurah?
Well, it's an interesting question, right? I mean, usually in Kabbalah, red is associated with judgment and anger, white with chesed, with mercy, well, smoke isn't really a color. But here, it's quite clear that, he says these are three different kinds of hell. There would be a long discussion. I mean, the Kabbalists, starting with the Zohar, or actually starting before the Zohar, and then intensifying as the centuries rolled by, we're very concerned with showing that everything that exists on the divine side exists on the demonic side. So that if there's a left, right, and center on the divine side, there's a left, right, and center on the demonic side. I'm not sure if that's what Chacham Yosef Chaim has in mind here. I think he's really sort of paying attention to different descriptions of hell in rabbinic literature, which talk about fire and talk about, hail or frozen hell, and also talks about smoke. I think he's more focused on that than necessarily about their spherotic correspondence.
They map onto something else.
Yeah.
Whether this is in intention, I don't know. I suspect the Zohar is influenced by this also. We should never forget that the two great enemies of Israel, which is Jacob, one is Edom and one is Lavan. One is red and one is white.
Ooh, nice.
And in point of fact, the Chumash actually plays with the colors. That's a longer conversation. It's not just red and white, but it's primarily white and red, the two enemies of Yaakov, both of whom are deeply involved in terms of anger, as I mentioned last time. So perhaps it's coming from that, but it does map onto that I think it's very interesting how it maps onto that.
Nice. That's beautiful. Okay, we're going to go to another Talmudic passage, and we'll see this becomes important for us as we go along. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yosef, how do we know that one should not try to appease a person at the time of his anger? When somebody's furious, don't try to, make nice with them. How do we know? For it is written, my face will go away and I will give thee rest. Now I'm translating it here. This is my translation, because this is not what this verse means in context. In context, it means much more like what the KJV, the King James Version, translates. My presence shall go with thee and I will give thee rest. The pasuk is, Panaye lechu v'hanichoti lach. And in context, it really means I will go with you. My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. I will make it good for you. They translated it as Panaye lechu, my face will go away. And what face? The face of rage. And I'm going to keep reading here. The Blessed Holy One said to Moshe, wait until the face of anger has passed away, and I will give thee rest. So this is this idea that even Moshe was not supposed to pray to God when God was angry. Wait to the person, and that person could be a divine person or a human person. But when the person is possessed by anger, it's not the time to try to appease them, to try to calm them down. Wait until the face of anger has passed away and I will give thee rest. That's how the Talmud is taking this line. It's an amazing thing. And I'm going to go on here and keep this in mind, okay? And then the Talmud goes on, or the voice of the Talmud goes on, the narratorial voice of the Talmud goes on. And is there anger before the Blessed Holy One? Yes, it says. It's what the Talmud always says when it wants to, like, when somebody expects the answer to be no, and they say no, yes. The answer is yes. For we learned, and God, El, rages every day. The El zo'em b'chol yom. That's a verse from Tehillim. And how long is his rage? An instant. Here I revert, that was my translation. Here I revert to Steinsaltz's translation. How much time does his anger last? An instant. And how long is an instant? 158,888th of an hour. That is an instant. That's how long God gets angry for. And no creature can precisely determine that moment when God becomes angry, except for Bil'am the wicked, about whom it is written, he who knows the knowledge of the Most High. Now, what does this mean? It says, don't try to appease somebody when they're angry, right? And how do we know that? We know that from God, who says, wait till I calm down, and then I can deal with you peacefully. And then the Talmud says, does God ever get angry? I mean, the Talmud is asking this question, centuries before Maimonides declared that God can never get angry, right? It's too bad that Maimonides didn't write before the Talmud, because then we could say that the Talmud was disagreeing with Maimonides. But unfortunately, Maimonides would not live for another, half a millennium. But it's like anticipating. Could God get angry? Yes, it does. Yes, he can. Okay. And why there's a verse? El zo'em b'chol yom. God rages every day. Right? And he says, but you know, they said no one can precisely determine it except for Bilam. And what are they talking about here? And this passage goes on for quite a while. That if you are able to determine the moment when God gets angry, you can channel that anger and use it to destroy things, to destroy your enemies. And Bilam, who's known both in Rabbinic and certainly in Kabbalistic literature as a great magician, the Talmud says he could determine exactly the moment when God gets angry and was able to use it for destructive purposes, could channel God's anger. And it's an amazing idea. Why? Because it's saying that Bilam could use God's anger for his own wicked purposes. That God is out of control anger can be used by someone who knows, like Bilam, the great magician, to destroy people. And the Talmud goes on and says that it's a good thing that this kind of anger never happened against the Israelites in the desert when Bilam was around. Because if God had done this particular kind of anger called Za'am, Bilam would have destroyed the entire Israelite nation. That's what the Talmud goes on to say. It's an amazing idea that when God gets this particular kind of angry, that anger can be used for wicked purposes by someone on earth, a human being who knows how to channel that anger. It's an amazing idea, right? And again, it goes, although this is centuries before Kabbalah, it goes along with this idea of a certain kind of demonic transformation of God. And I know that sounds very heretical, but hey, that's why they pay me the big bucks. I mean, just think about what the Talmud is saying. It's an audacious statement by the Talmud here, right? It's the kind of statement that sometimes you find in rabbinic literature. They say, if it wasn't written down, we wouldn't be allowed to say it, right? If it wasn't in the tradition, how could I, my insignificant little old me, how could I dare to say it? But there it is in the Talmud, that Bilam knew how to channel God's anger and could have used it to destroy the Israelites if God had gotten angry in that particular way in the desert. And we're going to see later about God getting angry in a way that induced him to desire to exterminate the Israelites in the desert. It actually happened more than once. Okay, questions?
Well, you mentioned before about not speaking to someone at moments of anger is reflected in the halacha. I think that what it says in Pirkei Avot and elsewhere, that you don't console a mourner, someone who's died, when the person has not yet been buried. And the idea is that there are times when you can't intervene, you shouldn't intervene, and you let you let something take its natural course. You don't try to console. There are moments when consolation is not called for. I think that's important. I would add that I can't imagine looking at the world every day and not getting angry, frankly, but that's another story.
Oh, I agree. That's that sign I put on the first day, that sign that appeared at a lot of demonstrations. If you're not angry, you're not paying attention. It's interesting that David mentions this thing about not doing nichum avilim, not comforting a mourner before the person is buried. My father's yahrzeit is tomorrow night, and I remember at his funeral, before the burial, somebody came over to me and said, and actually I was walking, I can't remember if it was at the cemetery or before that, and said, I hope the memories are a great comfort for you. And I knew that the person meant well. I knew that the person had only the best of intentions. But I said, memories? The guy's not in the ground yet. What do you mean memories? He was just here. He was just alive. He died of a sudden heart attack. He was just alive. And I didn't think at that time of that thing from Pirkei Avot, but later, when I reminded myself of it, there's a lot. The Jewish laws about mourning have a lot of wisdom in them. Okay, I'm going to plunge on a little bit.
Dr. Berman, could you just mention the name again of the God's anger that can be harnessed for evil?
The word
Zalam, you said?
Za'am, Zayin Ein Mem, Za'am. It's in that pasuk. It says El Zo'em B'chol Yom, and the PowerPoint is posted on the Drisha site, so you can look for it. And also I emailed it, so you can look at it. El Zo'em B'chol Yom. It's from Tehillim, and we're gonna work with that verse now for a little bit.
Zam is rage, isn't it?
Yeah, rage. Exactly. Okay.
I'm reminded now that one of the verses that we have in the Passover Haggadah, that section there which talks about the number of plagues. When the 10 plagues, there were 10 plagues in Egypt, but that you see there were either 50 or 200 or 250. And the verse they darshan, Yishalach bam charon apo, evra vazam mishrachet malchei ra'im. So there are actually many terms for anger there. One is zam, but there are a bunch of them, and each one is seen as it plays out in terms of plagues. Each one of them is, so we multiply the plagues. So evra vazam is.
There's actually a great book by somebody named Diane Grant called Divine Rage in the Hebrew Bible, and she goes through all the different verbs for anger and tries to systematize them. It's a great monograph. Okay. Moshe Alshich, who was a Kabbalist who lived in Tzfat in the middle of the 16th century, part of that flowering of Kabbalah in Tzfat then, and this is sort of a very simple explanation of a passage in the Zohar that we're about to look at. He says, the saying of the sages of truth, in other words, the Kabbalists, about the verse, and El rages all day, El zoem b'chol yom, for the attribute of El is chesed, loving kindness, that rebukes the attribute Elohim, which is associated with judgment, so that it should not activate anger. Okay. What is this saying? This is saying this. The verse, El zo'em b'chol yom, El, one of the names for God, rages every day, is a problem for the Kabbalists because it's a very well-established Kabbalistic tradition that the name of God, El, is associated with chesed, with loving kindness, not with gvura, with might, with anger, with judgment. So they have a problem. What does El zo'em b'chol yom mean? And their answer is that zo'em here doesn't mean rage, but means something like rebuke. And what's happening here is that the side of the divine which is associated with chesed, with kindness, with love, is rebuking the side of the divine associated with judgment and anger. So let's look at that again with that preface. The attribute of El is chesed that rebukes the attribute Elohim so that it should not activate anger. Now, this is a Kabbalistic version of the Talmudic thing that we did a couple of classes ago, where we learn that God's prayer is he prays that his mercy should overwhelm his anger or his judgment, right? His anger actually says that, okay? And this is a Kabbalistic version of that idea, that the name El should rebuke or repress the name Elohim.
Actually,
Go ahead.
actually, in the pasuk in Tehillim, the first part before Ve'el zo'em b'chol yom is Elohim shofet tzaddik. So it's the Elohim shofet tzaddik. How even when he's angry, Ve'el zo'em. So there's both the chesed and the ka'as at the same time.
Nice, right? We could say, and it's an interesting. I'm glad you brought up the whole verse, because the verse itself is sort of an interesting exemplification, right? And I couldn't say it better than you said it. When is Elohim shofet tzaddik? When El zo'em b'chol yom? When is the attribute of judgment a righteous judge? When it's rebuked by the attribute of chesed, right? So the El zo'em b'chol yom, God rages every day now, is not God rages every day at us, but at himself. It's about this internal struggle within the divine. And thank you for bringing up the pasuk. When El Zoim B'chol Yom, when the other side of the divine, the El side, the Chesed side, or in Kabbalistic geography, the right side, also the south side, rebukes the north side, the left side, the judgment side. Yes, Jay.
So it would seem that from these two texts, when you're confronted with anger, you need to let it pass before you intervene, but you can also try to prevent anger through compassion.
I think you make a very good comment that the texts that we just did are not consistent with each other in a way, right? I mean, the El Zoem B'chol Yom is really about this struggle in which you have to rage against rage, rage against your anger, right? And the other one is, wait till it calms down. They're actually quite different. I think the lessons are actually quite different. Now let's look at, we're going to look at this passage from the Zohar, which is basically it's where Moshe Al-Sheikh, who lived a couple of hundred years after the Zohar, where he got it from. And I just gave it because he does this in a very sort of nice, concise way. So this is from the Zohar. Rabbi Yehuda said, El rages every day. El zoim b'chol yom. And he says, could this mean that every day the world stands in judgment, whether the inhabitants of the world are meritorious or not? What does it mean, El zoim b'chol yom? What does it mean God rages every day? It doesn't matter what we do, he's always raging at us? He could not answer the question. It's interesting. When the Zohar says that one of its sages can't answer the question, you know that it's really a thorny problem. They don't just say this. This is not that common a formulation in the Zohar. They went and asked Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon is the hero of the Zohar. He knows everything. And if they go to Rabbi Shimon because they can't figure it out, it shows that this is a very serious problem that they can't do themselves. He said to them, and then I left part out, and then we go this here. This is Rabbi Shimon saying, El, the name El, in every place is the illumination of the supernal wisdom. So we don't go into it Kabbalistically, so that El is associated with the sphere of Chesed, the fourth sphere, and it's illuminated from the second sphere of Chokhmah. It is in touch with a very high place and illuminated by mercy and loving kindness, and stands in its place every day, as it is written, the Chesed of El every day. So there's also from Tehillim, it says Chesed El Kol Hayom. So they put that in juxtaposition with El Zoem Kol Yom. Okay. And if this El were not aroused in the world could not endure even 1 hour, due to the fierce judgments that are aroused in the world every day. And when Abraham is this guy who is this big character in the Torah. In Kabbalah, he's identified with the sphere of Chesed, of loving kindness. And one could talk a lot about the Zohar's notion of these biblical figures who not only symbolize, but also embody Sphirot. And some people use the word incarnation here, but that's a whole other set of controversies. When Abraham is aroused in the world, all of these judgments that are found each and every day, he casts them outside, and they do not stand before him. This is as is written, and El rages every day. Or I guess all day, I have it translated here. On each and every day that judgment is found, he repulses them outside, and he stands and renders the world fragrant. This is as written. By day, Havaya Yudhevave will command his chesed. Yomam Yitzaveh Hashem Chasto. And if not for this, the world would not endure even 1 instant. Okay, so this is sort of a longer, the Zoharic version of that nice, concise teaching by Moshe Al-Sheikh, right? Of the verse, El Zoem B'chol Yom, God rages every day, El rages every day. It is not talking about him raging against the world, but against another part of the divine self. This divine struggle. And Again, this teaching really is already in the Talmud. One might say it's already in the Torah. In the distinctiveness, of course, in the Kabbalistic reading is one thing that it is associated with these different divine names. And the different divine names are associated with different personae, divine personae, which are later Kabbalists called partsufim, faces, different faces of God. And I showed you a chart of the different faces of God a few classes ago. It relates, in my mind, although the Zohar doesn't make this explicit connection, to that Talmudic passage about panaye lechu v'anichotilach. My face will go, and I will give you rest, or I will be peaceful with you. My face of rage will pass away. And the Kabbalists took that kind of saying from the rabbis and took it very seriously. God is a face of rage. God is a face of loving kindness. These different partsufim, these different personae, again, associated with different divine names. And the Kabbalists are very, very attentive to the different divine names. One of my great frustrations in translation is that the translation established by the King James Version, or even earlier, of translating the Yud He Vav He as the Lord and Elohim as God is totally not useful, totally worthless when we're trying to teach Kabbalah. So when you're trying to teach Kabbalah, you have to be very attentive to the particular names. And of course, God in English is just like a generic word for God, whereas Elohim is a very specific name in Kabbalah. It relates to generally the left side of the divine, the side associated with judgment and with might. And it's very, very particular. And El is associated with the other side. El is also often translated in English translations as God. Of course, El and Elohim, as we've just seen, are really very different faces of God in Kabbalah. El associated with Chesed, Elohim with Gvura, with judgment or might. And we have this image of this internal struggle with God here. Now, a struggle between the different divine names. Right? And again, if you're not used to thinking Kabbalistically, you think, well, God has a lot of names. Yud He Vav He, Elohim, El. We could name a lot of other ones, Shaddai, right? So in Kabbalah, these are very, very specific names and can't be confused with each other. They represent very, very, very different things. And so much so that what you have in these passages is a struggle between the name El and the name Elohim.
Nathaniel, had a thought about this passage in the Zohar. I'm not saying the Zohar intends this at all, but it struck me very interesting that if you go back to Bilam, who knows the moment of anger, and the entire story of Bilam is actually about turning the intended curse into a blessing. And I wonder about that idea of God's face not going away, which is certainly not the plain meaning of the text at all.
Right.
And I'm wondering whether it can be understood not so much as God's face going away, because God is God and God's always there, but somehow being able to transform the anger into non-anger, or transform the curse into blessing. And what struck me as extremely interesting, much longer, where I teach you a class in Bible now, I would go into this in some depth, is the understanding by the Medrash and by rabbinic texts, and it's the plain meaning of the Torah, the many, many links between Bilam on one hand and Abraham on the other, and that actually the term El Elyon, which is found, Bilam says Yodea Dat Elyon, but the first time we encountered the word El Elyon, which is in our first blessing of our prayers, is with Abraham in Melchizedek. When Melchizedek says, Hu Kohen El Elyon, he's the priest to the El Elyon, and then Abraham swears by El, I lift up my hand to El Elyon, I'm not going to take from the king of Sodom. So he distances himself from evil at that moment, and Melchizedek comes with a blessing. Baruch Avram El Elyon, or Baruch El Elyon. So I think that a challenge would be for us how to transform the anger, because the anger is always there. There's always some anger there. And one approach would say to distance yourself from the anger. But a different approach might be to use the anger in some positive way and to transform it into somehow enable the anger, move the anger towards a place of blessing, which would be an interesting move, I think. I'm not sure the Zohar intends this, but it struck me as a very interesting move. It's about transforming the anger, using the anger in a positive way. Just a thought. But the Abraham-Bilam connection is very deep in the Torah, that's for sure.
Yes, and it's interesting that you bring up that pasuk of the blessing of Melchizedek to Avram, because in this saying that I've mentioned each time from the Zohar, rugza rugza, there's anger and there's anger. In that passage, when it talks about what is the blessing, it associates the cursed kind of anger with a set of figures, actually with Shimon and Levi, and also with the Nachash, and it associates the good kind of anger, and it's very, very surprising for the Zohar, with Avraham, and cites that very pasuk, Baruch Avram Le'elyon, and it's very sly on the Zohar's part, because Avram is usually not associated with anger at all in the Zohar. It's only chesed, 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 except in that passage and this passage, when it comes to this kind of anger. And of course, that is the one case, I believe, where Avram uses violence in the Torah. It actually comes after a war, the war of the 4 kings against the 5 kings.
Yeah.
And it's where, we get the Avram as warrior. And it's interesting that the Zohar picks up on that as an example of the good kind of anger. It's using the anger to fight for apparently what the Zohar used as a cause of justice.
Interesting.
The other thing that, as a good segue to the next reading, is that the figure that the Zohar most often juxtaposes with Bilam is, of course, also stemming from rabbinic tradition, is Moshe. And Bilam and Moshe are paired as, the greatest prophet among the Jews is Moshe, and the greatest prophet among the non-Jews is Bilam. And the Zohar really goes with that parallelism and describes Bilam in a way as a demonic version of Moshe. It's in a fascinating, really a fascinating passage. Okay, we're going to look now at this passage. So this is one of these cases in the desert where God threatens to exterminate the Israelites. So it's in the aftermath of the golden calf. God says to Moshe, it's not the only time, but it's one of the 2 or 3 times when God threatens to exterminate the entire people. He says, now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may wax hot against them, that I may consume them, and I will make of thee a great nation. Who needs the Israelites? We're going to start all over again. We'll have the Mosesites that will replace them. I'll exterminate them all. Okay. And there's a long passage on the Zohar on this, and I'm just giving you one paragraph here that's at the bottom of the page in Aramaic. And there's an interesting verb here that we could talk about, but I don't want to dwell on it at the moment. It says 3 times God punctuated Moshe. And this is a strange verb, ankid. It's very, very hard to translate, but prodded, pointed, punctured, could even be punctured. But anyway, going on here. Oh, Moshe, this is the Zoharic narrator, the Zoharic speaker says, it's actually Rabbi Shimon. O Moshe, faithful shepherd, how strong is your power, how great is your might. 3 times he punctuated him, as it is written. Now therefore let me alone, this is 1, that my wrath may wax hot against them, and that I may consume them, that's 2. And I will make of thee a great nation, this is 3. The wisdom of Moshe was in these 3 points, and playing on that verb, ankid nikuda. Moshe sees God's right arm, corresponding to, let me alone. So he does the opposite of what God says, right? Grabs God's right arm. He sees his left arm, corresponding to that my wrath may wax hot against them, that I may consume them. Again, doing the opposite of what God wants. So Moses now is grabbing onto God's 2 arms. He embraced the body of the king. And the word here is really embrace, but it says he gives him a bear hug, corresponding to, and I will make of thee a great nation. And when Moshe embraced the body, this is the body of God. Note, it's the body of God. If Maimonides were listening to us, he would not be happy. When Moshe embraced the body and the two arms from this side and that side, God could not budge to any side of the world. Moshe immobilizes God. This was the wisdom of Moshe, that in relation to all the kinds of points of the king, he understood all of them, in which place to hold fiercely, and he acted in wisdom. I'm going to talk about this just in a second. Let me just finish the narrator goes on. So Rabbi Elazar, that's Rabbi Shimon's son, and the companions came and kissed the hands of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Abba was there and said, if we had only come to the world to hear this, it would be enough for us. Now, what are these points, right? These points are clearly some kind of Kabbalistic wisdom, and undoubtedly they are related to the Sfirot, or the elite, the Sfirot, or groups of Sfirot, one on the left side, one on the right side, and one group in the center. Could be Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferet, mercy, judgment, and beauty. But here, God has become this being of rage. And what Moshe here is doing is a kind of tikkun, kind of rectification, a kind of repair, a kind of healing of God, but in a physically almost violent way. He grabs God's right arm. He grabs God's left arm. He puts him in a bear hug, and God is immobilized. And that's why we're here today. If Moshe had not done this, God would have exterminated the Israelites. No drisha. Now that's why I put for the image, for the graphic image today, the image of Jacob wrestling with the angel, because clearly the Zohar here, although it doesn't mention Jacob and the angel, is inspired by that story of a biblical figure here, Moshe, not Yaakov, and it's God, not the angel, right? Clearly inspired by that image of Jacob and the angel, right? Transferring it audaciously with utter chutzpah, as the Zohar does, to a human being's relationship to God. Just think how much more audacious it is than the scene with Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael, God says, bless me. And Rabbi Yishmael doesn't dare to say anything until God says, bless me. Then Rabbi Yishmael says, I bless you that your mercy should prevail over your anger, right? Now, one way of understanding this verb, this problematic verb on kid, would be that God is sort of asking to be restrained. That's one way of interpreting it. But this physical image here, and again, whoever said before, what about that passage in the Talmud? Again, this is even more the opposite of the passage in the Talmud that says, don't try to deal with somebody when they're angry, right? Here, Moshe actually physically restrains God. Now this is something that you should let sink in, right? Everything one is taught about God in the more conventional approaches to Judaism, to try to make sense of this, they would probably convert. If somebody was teaching this, was concerned to reconcile this with the Rambam, would say, well, it's just a metaphor, it's a symbol, it's a parable, it's a story, right? The Zohar does things for a reason. It's an image of this wrestling with God, again, which the name, of course, Yisrael comes from, this idea of wrestling with God. Here the Zohar, again, transposed it from Yaakov and the angel to Moshe and God, right? That without human being performing this physical tikkun, divine rage would be so out of control that it would exterminate the Jewish people. So, Jay.
So just like Bilam can have the ability, the wisdom to know the exact moment were to happen, that he could use God's anger for destruction, Moshe has the ability, the wisdom to recognize that exact point where he could restrain God from enacting destruction.
Beautiful, 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 wonderful. When you say that, I want to go now back to it's part of a very long passage in Zohar to see if they talk about Bilam. Beautiful. I couldn't have said it better myself. Beautiful, right? Beautiful. Moshe and Bilam are both, in a way, magicians, or both people who know how to channel divine power, right? That's beautiful, right? And the knowledge attributed to Bilam by the Talmud already, right? That he knew how to channel God's rage and could have used it to exterminate the Israelites. Oh, beautiful, Jay. Right?
Nathaniel, it strikes me that the Zohar actually, I don't know about holding on to the body, but in terms of the first two passages, the first two pieces, it strikes me that they're actually different. That it is, in fact, in the Torah, God's invitation, that's for sure. Leave me alone means don't leave me alone. But it strikes me that the first one, Hanichali, is not so much wrestling. It's like someone's walking away from you and you grab onto them to hold them. They shouldn't leave you.
Yeah.
The second one is actually stopping God from, the second, the Charapi Bahem, is Moshe preventing it. But the first one, which is the right side, which is the side of Chesed or whatever, Moshe is actually not allowing the Chesed to leave. Moshe holds on, he's holding on to something. It's more holding on in the first case. In the second case, it's preventing. He's blocking it. That's more of a wrestling mode. But the first is more, you're walking away, I grab onto you and say, don't leave me, which is different, I think.
Nice, nice. It reminds me of, for those of you who are fans of the Grateful Dead, there's a Grateful Dead song that starts off, I won't sing it. You told me goodbye. How was I to know? You didn't mean goodbye. You meant, please don't let me go.
Right. Exactly.
Great. And you're welcome for not singing it. Somebody else had their hand up.
Dr. Berman, yes. I just had it resonate. Actually, here's this physical struggle between Moshe and God, but it resonated for me because of the invitation of, please stop me, with the argument Avraham has with God before the destruction of Sodom. Because there too, God sort of says, you hear him as a monologue saying, shouldn't I tell this guy? Of course I should tell him. And then he tells him, and he engages in this whole long struggle with him where Abraham keeps, going down and down. But there's some kind of similarity here where Abraham is trying to stop God's destructiveness, not of Israel in this case, of Sodom.
It's good. It's a great analogy. And apparently Avram wasn't as great a Kabbalist as Moshe was, because he didn't know the points. He didn't know how to wrestle God and immobilize him the way Moshe did, right? And it's a really good analogy. Yeah, Beth.
Are we absolutely sure that he is really restraining God? How do we know that he's not embracing God? How do we know this isn't a hug rather than a wrestling hold?
I think that's, it's a very good point, right? And I think that we could spend a lot of time on the language of this passage. In the Aramaic, it really does say he embraced him. The word itchabak, which is for people who know Hebrew, from the word lachabok in Hebrew, right? That of course is embrace, right? And the Zohar, for the most part, the Zohar is very, very careful about its language, right? And the image of somebody, grabbing somebody, holding them by the arms and embracing their body is a very erotic image, right? I mean, truthfully, wrestling could be viewed as a sort of, crypto-erotic sport. And there's a lot of things that look like embrace in wrestling. When you think of Jacob and the angel, he's in a way embracing him, and that's how you immobilize somebody. That's that word. That's why I use the English word bear hug, right? Which is a hug, but is also something that is, could be fatal. I think there's an ambiguity here. Yeah, I think there's real ambiguity here. Yeah, David.
I just wanted to add one to what Judy had said before, just to slightly embellish what she said, which is that in the case of Avraham, God says, I can't conceal from Avraham what I plan to do because I know he commands his household, Lasot Tzedakah Mishpat. And when Abraham prays to God, he says, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Perhaps there are tzaddikim. So actually, God doesn't only encourage Abraham, he actually gives him the script. He actually tells him what to say. Tzedakah mishpat that's Abraham's argument. So there, it's actually God giving him the script. It doesn't work because God listens patiently, but at the end of the day, the story of Sodom demonstrates that even though Abraham was very eloquent, but the people of Sodom don't merit being saved. That's clear. Whereas in the case of Israel, we have a better case than Sodom. But in any event, I think Judy's point is very well taken.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it also highlights the Zohar's artistry. One of the things that the Zohar does, and in this, it's really a continuer of the rabbinic tradition, but it does it even more so, is it takes raw material from all over the Jewish tradition and weaves them together to form something new. So you read a passage like this, you could think of Jacob and the angel, you could think of Abraham, you could think of there are lots of other associations as well from the Midrash that could be brought in here. And part of the, really study the Zohar, you have to have a lot of the precursor texts, and you see how the Zohar weaves them together and creates something new and distinctive and often very audacious out of those raw materials. Okay, last reading for our course. Yeah, oh, sorry, somebody had their hand up?
Yes, about whether it was a hug or a restraining.
Yeah.
I had an image that it was not erotic, but when you have a toddler having a tantrum,
yes,
you might hold them,
yes,
and we're embracing them and restraining them.
Yes, yes.
In opposition to the old way they used to do in mental hospitals where they would put you in a straitjacket. So and this is very different than Abraham because Abraham was using his mind. It was like an argument.
Yes.
This is much more primal.
Yes, excellent. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. That was beautiful. That's beautiful. And by the way, as you're talking to me, I'm looking back at the Aramaic original, and I see that it's an interesting thing. The words that I translated is that God could not budge. The verb in Aramaic is la yachia li na'ana'a, right? And that is the same verb that is used in the Talmud when Rabbi Yishmael blesses God that your mercy should prevail over your anger. It says, and God nodded his head to him, right? And it's the same verb, ni'ana lo berosho, right? And we say it in Anim Zmirot, right? Birchatit na'ana li rosh. It's the same verb here, right? And I it's very often the Zohar, these are usually not coincidences in the Zohar. They're very attuned to what they're doing and the way they use language. And it wouldn't surprise me at all that verb is chosen precisely to evoke that Talmudic passage. Okay, let me go to our last reading here, which is in a way the punchline of the whole course, and also one of my favorite passages in all of Jewish writing, which is, it's the doctrine of alien thoughts, of Mashavot Zarot in early Hasidism. And, well, actually, when I look at you, I'm saying this first part. As many of you may know, early Hasidism gave a great place to prayer, often elevating it above Torah study, right? And one of the things one of the problems that preoccupied them was prayer is such an amazing thing, but we all know, except for the three purely righteous tzaddikim that are on this screen, except for you three, and you know who you are, All the rest of us, often when we pray, we try to have great kavanah, great intention. Often all of these distracting thoughts come up. Sometimes they're really bad thoughts. Sometimes they're just, what am I going to make for dinner, or what about my homework, or whatever, right? It's a struggle. And actually, it's not just with Jewish prayer. Meditation traditions all over the world deal with this question of what do you do with these thoughts? And Buddhist meditation has an answer, and various traditions have various answers, right? And this was a problem that preoccupied a lot of these early Hasidic sages. And they came up with this doctrine called the doctrine of Mashavot Zarot, alien thoughts. And I want to conclude with this because we started off with this notion that anger is the El Zar, the alien god within the person. And that an angry person is viewed as someone who is engaged in avodah zara, alien worship. And that's why I'm stressing the alien here. And here in Hasidism, hundreds and hundreds of years later, the doctrine of Mashavot Zarot, alien thoughts, right? And what to do with them, okay? And the basic doctrine, I'm going to look at it in this text, is you have to understand that the thoughts are alien because they have become separated from their source in holiness. And when they're separated from their source in holiness, they become alien and they become bad. They become alienated from you. They seem alien, they seem foreign to you, even though they're within you. But if you could reconnect them to their source in holiness, you would become reintegrated. And for those of you who know a little bit about psychoanalysis, you can hear an anticipation of Freud's idea of the id here, although I don't think he studied these particular texts. And let's look at the way this text works. It's an amazing doctrine, and then it talks about how to understand what to do with anger that arises in you. And this is from Yaakov Yosef HaKohen of Polnoi. His book, Tolat Yaakov Yosef, was really the first redaction of the Hasidic teachings that we have deriving from the Baal Shem Tov. Okay. The elevation of the sparks concerns the rising of thoughts in a person's mind when he offers his prayers. The wise man with eyes in his head knows how to refine the interior essence of the alien thoughts. And what are the alien thoughts? Last two lines, the holy sparks that entered into the klipot, the shells, Kabbalistic word for the demonic realm, right? And thus they become alien thoughts. So they're holy sparks that have broken off, that have become dissociated. And remember, with anger, we talk about dissociation. The dissociation, we've thought of in the Zohar, the dissociation of God's anger from God's thought. And the remedy through the incense ritual of reconnecting the anger to the thought and thereby appeasing the anger. Let me look at the next page. Oops. For example, and this is something they were very preoccupied with. If there come to him, they're talking about the male praying person, lustful thoughts about women. This derives from chesed, from the sphira, the divine sphira of chesed, of loving kindness. He should understand that if he has this desire merely because of the single holy spark that is there, a fallen spark, how much greater will be his delight if he attaches himself to the source of this delight. For there the delight is altogether limitless and incomparable. If love of, carnal love is wonderful, love of God is amazing. The same applies to thoughts of idolatry and the shedding of blood, which is of the left column. And here's the payoff from a different part of the book. These three columns, chesed, loving kindness, gvura, might, tiferet, beauty, those are the left, right, and center of the divine structure. They expand from the loftiest of levels to the abyss, the place of the klipa, the demonic. And chesed in the place of holiness is delight. And when it expands below in the klipa, when it falls, it is sexual licentiousness. And the column of tiferet in the place of the klipa is pride. And here's the part that interests us. And the column of gvura below is anger and alien worship. So anger is viewed here as a machshava zara, an alien thought, and associated with avodah zara, alien worship, again, implicitly evoking the Talmud. And it's like a flame connected to a burning coal, this and that, all the way above, where it's all the way from the top of the divine to the bottom of the demonic. But below, in the demonic, in the fallen form, it is without knowledge, where he transcends awareness, dot. And above it is with awareness. He should direct his knowledge, his awareness, so that he should delight more in the service of the blessed name and not in the place of filth. And the dimension of tshuva, what does tshuva mean? It means gaining awareness and ending the dissociation within you and understanding a way, a technique of taking your anger, not denying it, but seeing its relationship to a holy source. And then for the last slide in the course, the slogan of the course, there's anger and there's anger, the rugza, and the whole trick is trying to understand which is which. So, thoughts, Ruth?
So that ties in really nicely with Vayipach be'apav, very beginning, because it's not apo, one, it's apav. There are two angers. There's this anger and that anger.
Nice.
They are both divine.
Yes, beautiful, beautiful.
And then God gives them to man.
Beautiful, beautiful. And we relate that to the other pasuk we did is Toref nishmato be'apo, right? Which uses the singular, right? Remember that the verse, the one who tears his soul in his anger, Toref nishmato be'apo, the person who removes their holy soul and puts in its place a demonic being.
Right.
Beautiful. Other comments?
Just
Yeah,
a question.
Go ahead.
Question about Hester Panim. How does the Zohar look at Hester Panim? You're talking about Pnei Hashem, Partzufei Hashem. How about Hester Panim?
You know, in the Zohar, there's never a vacuum, right? In the Zohar, you're either in the presence of the divine or you're in the presence of the demonic. There's a great passage in the Zohar that I don't think I put on any of the slides that says, Kama panim upanim itle l'kuchabricho. How many faces upon faces has the Blessed Holy One? And then it goes through like 8 pairs, right? It says, you know, near faces, far faces, faces above and faces below, and it goes on and on like this. And it really is, you're always in the face. I think in the Zohar, if there's Hester Panim, it will be the concealment of one kind of face and the emergence of another kind of face. There's no vacuum in the Zohar. It's either going to be good or is it going to be bad? The Zohar is very binary in that way.
Right.
Interestingly, yeah.
I had a thought about the story of Jacob wrestling with this person angel. I don't know if this was your intention in with the first illustration you had up, but what's I think incredibly interesting is that the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel and the story of Bilam are actually parallel stories. In each case, somebody comes to curse, Bilam intends to curse, and the curse becomes a blessing. Well, in the case of Jacob wrestling with this angel, or rather maybe the angel wrestling with Jacob, he comes to destroy him. He's certainly Vayeyovek Ishimo. He comes to wrestle. Vayeyovek with the word avak, which is afar, which is the place of the nachash. He comes to destroy him. And maybe Jacob is worthy of being destroyed at that point and not crossing over. And then something mysterious happens that night. And through his own transformation, the Ish becomes transformed as well. Because then the Ish blesses him at the end and actually changes Jacob's name. So there you have precisely what you're talking about, which is what happens on the human sphere. Some kind of transformation is reflected in the other sphere with this Ish. And Jacob says, I have seen God face to face, and I have survived. So there you have actually precisely what you mentioned at the end about elevating the sparks, somehow to transform the anger or the intended anger or the intended destructiveness into the greatest blessing. And that's when Israel actually is born. Israel is born that night when the anger becomes morphed into some kind of blessing. And that's, I think, the idea of, with the Hasidism sort of Nachman is very central to his thinking, that you try to transform these alien thoughts or move them to a different place, and challenge of prayer. So it was interesting that you chose that image in the beginning, because it is precisely parallel to Bilam. And the challenge is how does one do this? What is the internal mechanisms? What are the mechanisms for transforming the anger into, or the curse into blessing?
Yes. Yeah. Something I wanted to add was that you know, if we started the course or very early on with this passage in the Talmud about Rabbi Ishmael helping God struggle with anger, right? And whenever that was written, the Talmudic passage, 5th century, something like that. Here we get this passage in this Hasidic text, 13 centuries later, telling people how to wrestle with their own anger, right? And giving you instruction of how to do it, how to actually engage in that process. God had Rabbi Ishmael to help him out in the Talmud. I guess by the time it gets up to the Hasidic master, he says, well, I guess you're on your own. You have to learn this technique of the elevation of your alien thoughts to reintegrate yourself. And it becomes give you very concrete instructions about how to engage in this practice. By the way, this doctrine of alien thoughts and the dealing with your alien thoughts is all over early Hasidic writing in the first generation, and a couple of generations later, it came to be viewed as too dangerous. Right. In other words, this doctrine of alien thoughts, the audaciousness of it, and this is also part of the message of the course, is it's not about chasing away the alien thoughts. Right. It's not about, you know, trying to like get rid of them. It's saying, no, you shouldn't try to get rid of them. You have to confront them. Why? Because they're really part of you that got split off. And here's the very, very sort of proto-Freudian idea, right? You shouldn't ignore them. You should confront them and look at what's holy about them. Try to get that spark of holiness and reconnect it to the holy. Within a couple of generations, Hasidic masters started saying, this is too dangerous for regular people. This is only for the Rebbe. Regular people shouldn't do this. Regular people should just try to repress their thoughts, right? And it's an amazing, the history of this doctrine is really quite amazing, because for me, it's one of the most profound insights of early Hasidic writing. And yet it's dangerous, and sure, it is dangerous. It's this idea that you have to confront that bad stuff within is dangerous, you know, and you could easily get trapped there. So it's a very, very fraught practice. There's a very, very excellent book called Hasidic Prayer by Louis Jacobs, an old book, really fantastic short book. It's the first thing I ever read about Hasidism, and I just fell in love with it, with the whole topic of the early Hasidic teachings about prayer. And I really recommend it. It's really stood the test of time, this book. It's sort of it's an academic book, but it's sort of on the border of an academic book and also a more spiritual book. Really fantastic short work. Other comments?
One question I would have is, I know this is probably a much broader topic itself, but when thinking about like how people like Rambam or people who are strict Maimonideans would like take Zoharic texts or take kind of these different modalities of anger, would they still take this seriously, or would they just kind of imagine it in a way that was very kind of metaphorical and in that kind of respect?
Okay, well, you know, I mean, you know, it's a good question. Look, the Rambam, the Zohar was written, you know, the Rambam died in the first decade of the 13th century, and the Zohar was written in the last, say, most of the Zohar is written probably in the last 3 decades of the 13th century. And the Zoharic writers all knew Rambam. I mean, they didn't know him personally, but they knew his works. They're writing under his influence. They're rebelling against him, but they're also influenced by him. And you know, it's very fraught, this question of the Rambam. So they have a very deliberate and conscious relationship to the Rambam. And then in the early 14th century, you find Kabbalistic writers writing, denouncing, and you don't really get denunciations of the Rambam and the Zohar, because the whole thing is written as though it was written in the 2nd century. But in the early 14th century, you get Kabbalistic writers denouncing the Rambam in the strongest possible terms. But then, not long after that, people tried to reconcile them. And the tradition of reconciling the Rambam and the Zohar became a great strand of Jewish thought. Probably if I was in Maimonidean and I read this passage in the Zohar, I'd say I would interpret it as the Rambam interprets the Torah. The Torah is constantly portraying God as getting angry. And the Rambam says it doesn't really mean that, right? The Rambam says, when it says that God gets angry, God never gets angry. We only say God gets angry as a way of describing the effect of our sins on the world, which produces punishment, and we say that's anger, right? And they would interpret the Zohar the same way. I mean, if the Rambam could, reinterpret the entire Torah from Reishit to Divrei Yamim, l'shitato, he could do the same with the Zohar, right? But it's quite clear the Zohar is even this description of Moshe wrestling with the body of God, and this constant reference to the body of God in the Zohar, they know exactly what they're doing, right? If there's one thing that the Rambam said is that God doesn't have a body. And when the Zohar says, Gufa de Malka, the body of the king, they know exactly what they're doing, right? And it's really a different path in Jewish religiosity. They're really different paths. Even though, as I say, within a few generations or a century, people already tried to start reconciling them, and that became, a real thing, to the point where even the conflict. I mean, if you look at Chabad thought, they don't even recognize that there's a conflict. But whereas in the Zohar, it's quite clear. When we're talking about Gufa de Malka, just a few decades after the Rambam died, it's very, very deliberate. It's a very, very deliberate transformation of the conception of the divine. The conception of worship of God is quite different.
And are they saying that deliberately because they really imagine an embodied God, or?
That would require another course. Did they think that they could sit at a table with God? Like, I could sit at a table with my daughter? I don't think so, right? But there's a very, very different place to the imagination. For the Rambam, the imagination is really demoted. In fact, in one passage in the guide, he identifies the imagination with Sama'el, right? Now, Sama'el is the main Jewish word for the devil. Now, Ram doesn't think Sama'el exists, right, as a separate entity. And anyway, it's a long story. But basically, for the Rambam, the imagination is bad. It's more complicated than that. It's more complicated than that, but just for the sake of, we only have a couple of minutes left. Whereas the Zohar, it's about the proliferation of the imagination. Right? And when human beings imagine, they imagine with bodies and with concrete material things. So it's a complicated topic. The next course, maybe we'll take that on.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'm confused about something, right? When you say that the Rambam, and I know, the quote about imagination and the Rambam, but actually because God is not corporeal, that implies then the imagination, but it's a more literary imagination. It's not these are not iconic representations. Whereas in the Zohar, it creates a very iconic representation, this idea of Moshe as the container, right? And that he has to hold God. He has to hold the nation that's falling apart. So in the Zohar, these are, the representations are more pictorial. Right?
Yes.
But I would argue that actually for Rambam, the imagination is invoked, but it's a literary imagination. It's a linguistic imagination, but it's imagination nonetheless.
Yeah.
But it's not iconic representation.
I mean, again, as I say, it's a huge topic. Obviously, one could write, and people have written books about Rambam and imagination. Just something to remember is that there's a pasuk in Tehillim that says, "L'cha dumia tehillah," And, it seems to mean for you, for God, silence is praise. And the Rambam loves that. He loves that. For Rambam, if you have to say one pasuk from the entire Tanakh, that would be the pasuk that the Rambam would like the most. For the Rambam, you can't say anything about God. And it's called negative theology, that you cannot affirm anything to be true of God. You can only affirm what is not true of God. You can say God doesn't have a body, but you can't say what God is. So l'cha dumia tila, for you, praise is silence. For the Rambam, that is kol haTorah kula, right? It's the entire teaching of Judaism for him. The Zohar takes that same verse and views that as a tragedy. He says, the Zohar tonight, I won't go through the whole thing, but it says, when is there silence? When the male part of God and the female part of God, and the male persona and the female persona are separated, then there's silence, and there's no tehillah, there's no praise, right? And when they're together, then there's tehillah and there's tefillah. And in fact, one of the words for the Shekhinah in the Zohar is tefillah. And the male persona is called the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Blessed Holy One. The female is called the Shekhinah. And the male is associated with kol, with voice, and the Shekhinah, the female, with speech. And when they're united, when kol and dibur are united, that's when human beings talk. They unite kol and dibur. It's like you're creating the unification of God. So it's the proliferation of language, of speech, that is the Zohar's glory. And that's why the Zohar just goes, you get the feeling with the Zohar, they could have gone on and on, right? They could just go on and on. Whereas the Rambam is saying, don't say anything. The less you say, the better, right? They're very, very different paths in the understanding of God and in the understanding of prayer as well.
I mean, there's a theme throughout that's in the Kabbalah that letatar bli, there's no place without God. That means within us, when we have, whether our demonic side or our anger, it must be, it's not so much it's a projection that's God, but rather, since God is everywhere, he has to have anger as we have. He has to have the demonic side as we have. And it's that struggle, because we all struggle with it. So God must be struggling too, because we are all an embodiment of, there is no thing without God. So therefore, we're sort of, the only way we can know God is through our own recognition of what we experience. I just wanted to make one other point about the word ankid and nekuda, because I find that very fascinating. As Moshe was picking up every nekuda that God noted and turned it around and transformed it. So he was taking the essence, the nekuda, which the Sfat Emes's concept of nekuda, and he turned it around. So in certain ways, it sounds as if the Kabbalah is using man's every aspect, the id and everything else, as a way of beginning to struggle with an understanding of God, because there is nothing else.
Yes. No, very eloquent. I agree with every word you said. By the way, the saying that Chaim is referring to is actually from the Tikkunei Zohar, which is a slightly later work than the main body of the Zohar, probably written in the first decade of the 14th century. The phrase is let atar panui mine. There's no place that is empty of him, of God, right? And in the same work in the Tikkunei Zohar, there's another very similar saying. It says let ever panui mine. There's no limb devoid of God, right? And when they say limb, they're actually literally talking about the limbs of a person. And they go through great detail with the limbs and even the internal organs. There are lengthy descriptions of the internal organs and how they correspond to various aspects of the divine, and how you sort of bring the divine into the limbs and the internal organs of your body. One of the most famous passages, the Kabbalistic passages, is a passage from the Tikkunei Zohar that's known as the Patach Eliyahu. Eliyahu opened, and it's famous in certain circles because it is in Hasidic liturgy and in Edot HaMizrach liturgy, it's chanted before every tefillah. And that Patach Eliyahu goes through the correspondence between the limbs of the human body and the sfirot, the structures of the divine. And it's called it's often printed in Sidurim as Tefillah Kodem Tefillah. It's what you're supposed to say before you pray. And I think it's because you sort of situate God in your body before you pray. And that's a very typical passage in a way, or emblematic passage of that work, the Tikkun Zohar.
Nathaniel, I wanted just to, the last thing I wanted to say was that I remember when I was briefly dabbled with the idea of pursuing a doctorate in philosophy, I dropped it, but had a teacher, a very interesting character, Hiram J. McQuendon. He had been a pupil of Bertrand Russell. I remember one day he gets up, he's a very interesting character. He gets up and he says, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they're all myths, and they're all true. That actually stuck with me.
Nice.
And I think that you called the Zohar Jewish mythology. Well, I'll tell you the truth. I see the Torah is also Jewish mythology, as is the Rambam. That is to say, it's a way of seeing the world. My own interest in it has to do with, I don't buy any of the systems, I just put it out there, but it's what does this way of seeing the world imply? And how does it speak to us? And what does it direct us to do? The Zohar, it strikes me, is very much focused on God in this world. Okay, there's the Ein Sof. We basically never mention the Ein Sof. We mention the way God operates in the world, the processes within God. And I think that's one way to see the world. The Rambam had a different way to see the world. I think the Torah, that myth, is a different way to see the world. And I think that what's interesting is to try to figure out how these different ways of seeing reality speak to us and how they direct us and what they're moving us to do and commanding us to do. So I think that's an interesting, and there are many paths, as we know, many paths to the top of the mountain, but I think it's very interesting to think about the implications that all of these different ways of seeing ourselves and our world, how they're seeing the world and what their expectations are from us, etc. It's radically, as you said before, the Zohar doesn't have any kind of neutral space, which I find problematic. I will just put out there, but it doesn't. Everything's fraught. That's one way to see the world. It's very intense. For others, that's not the case. Whether I paint my room off-white or brown is not a moral decision. But for the Zohar, it probably is. Anyway, thank you very much for working with you together. It's always great, and looking forward to the next opportunity too.
Indeed. And
we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Well, actually, I just wanted to say before Yehudis banged the gavel, several times you've referred to, well, that's a whole other course. So I'd just like to know when and where is your next course?
We're talking about perhaps late spring. So stay tuned. Thank you.
I think after Passover. After Passover.
Yeah.
That's what it sounds like from the scheduling standpoint.
Yes. But thanks a lot for your interest, and I hope to see you in the next time, and maybe someday in person.
Right.
That would be lovely.
Amen.
Very, very soon. Amen. Thank you so much, Dr. Berman. Thank you so much, Rabbi Silber. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight on Zoom and really the whole series on Drusha Live and on Facebook. So with the coming of the new calendar year, Drusha is starting a new winter series based on the 6th parak of Brachot, Ketzad Mevarchin. It's the theme of Not by Bread Alone, Jewish perspectives on food. So we have a morning Seder, we have an afternoon Seder, we have evening sessions available. And so I want to invite you to join us for either one or all of our classes. And hot off the presses, we have a new class on New Year's Day, Friday, January 1st at 10 a.m. Eastern on the blessings of 2021. Very, very timely. Should one say a bracha when receiving the COVID vaccine? So I will post the link in the chat and on Facebook and all of our classes. They're free of charge, and I do hope that you'll register and learn more with us at Drisha, www.drisha.org/classes. So hopefully I won't see you, maybe I won't see you next week, but I hope to see you all very, very soon, either in cyber world or otherwise. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.